So welcome everyone to our webinar on the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk Stewardship Plan, Indigenous Knowledge to Recover Caribou. My name is Amanda Sheedy. I am an independent consultant and I support the Indigenous Knowledge Circle of the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium, who is the host of today's webinar with our the two nations who brought this plan to life. So we have members of the Chipewyan Cree, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, as well as the Mikisew Cree First Nation with us here today, and I'll introduce them to you in a bit more detail shortly. But before we start, I'd like to welcome Cyprien from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, who's going to open our meeting in a good way with that prayer.
Thank you, Amanda. Everybody can just stay seated, relax, and I'll begin. Creator, open our hearts to peace and healing between all people. Creator, open our hearts to provide and protect for all children of the earth. Creator, open our hearts to respect for the earth and all the gifts of the earth. Creator, open our hearts to end exclusion, violence, and fear among all. Thank you for the gifts of this day and every day. Marcy Cho.
Marcy Cho, Laurie. So today's webinar, as I mentioned, is hosted by the Indigenous Knowledge Circle of the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium. And we've hosted a number of these over the last few years in the interest of really centering and hearing from people who are centering Indigenous knowledge in their planning for caribou. So our questions that are kind of guiding the presentations today are: how have you centered Indigenous knowledge to protect and recover caribou? And I think you'll see that the work that they've done on this plan very much does this. And how do you propose balancing the impacts from development and economic gain with the needs to protect caribou and uphold Indigenous rights? So the way the webinar is going to run today is we'll hear presentations from Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, as well as the Mikisew Cree First Nation. And that will be followed by a panel discussion with a couple other members of their team, including the Firelight Consulting. That'll last for about 30 or 40 minutes. So that'll be a chance for all of you to ask your questions. And we've really given this a good chunk of time because I think, as you'll see, this is a really great case of an Indigenous-led plan for caribou. Next slide. So just quickly, so you know where we are coming from, the Indigenous Knowledge Circle it advocates for and provides the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium with guidance and feedback on the relationship with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems. So you can see how this kind of fits squarely within our mandate. And for those of you who may not know the NBCKC, it's a forum that brings people together across sectors to generate and mobilize knowledge to support conservation and recovery of boreal caribou. It's coordinated through the Secretariat, which is housed at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I have with me today my colleague, Kristen Clark, who is co-facilitates the Indigenous Knowledge Circle with me there. Next slide. So we just like to call into this webinar, as in all spaces where we find ourselves with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous parties at the table, that we are aspiring to hold an ethical space. What we mean by this is that history matters. So the history of colonialism and its many, many impacts is accepted as fact. We're not going to debate that. And I think it's more a question of how are we moving on from that era, that dark era where this was not acknowledged, and how are we changing things now to reverse some of that. This is a non-political space for dialogue and learning. We're here as individuals, and aside from the presenters, those of us who are here, please consider yourselves representatives, not representing your organization, so we can have a free dialogue. The intent of this is to advance reconciliation. Even in these small instances, we can think of them as opportunities for change. Next slide. So very quickly, we just like to get a sense of who's in the Zoom room. I invite you, as always, to use the chat as much as you like. I'm just going to launch a quick poll, and you are also welcome to have a look at the participant list with that icon down at the bottom. That'll tell you the names of everyone who's here. So you should see a little pop-up unless you've joined on your web browser platform. If you have an app, you should see a little window. That's we're just wondering what region of Canada you're in, and also what sector you come from. So just take a moment to answer those if you can. Okay, and I think you just need to press, there's a blue button at the bottom that says select or something. So just don't forget to click on that. I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so here we go. We've got about 25% of you are from the West Coast, big majority from the prairies. Very interesting. I guess that's because this is about Alberta. And I noticed from the invite list, we had a lot of Government of Alberta folks coming, which is great. 9% of you from Northern Canada, another 16 from Central Canada, and a handful from the East Coast. That's great. Thank you. And then the sectors that are organized, we have 25% from Indigenous nations, governments, or organizations. That's great. So this is, then we have 50% of the crowd here is from Crown governments. It's great to see such a big interest from Crown governments in this subject. And we have a handful from consulting firms, another handful from ENGOs or nonprofits, and another handful from industry with one other. Ooh, I'm curious to know who that other is. Okay, wonderful. So that just gives us a quick overview of who's in the Zoom room today. So if you could just stop sharing, that would be great. And I would just like to, we're going to shift now into the presentation from our 2 representatives. And I'd just like to introduce them quickly. Laurie Cyprien, who just gave us the opening prayer. Thank you again, Laurie, is a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations, where she works as Director of Rights and Lands, Dené Lands and Resource Management. She's always maintained a strong connection to her home and her culture, loving the outdoors and natural resources. She has devoted herself to the environmental sector. Welcome, Laurie. It's great to have you here. Yeah. And just to right beside her, you'll see Sebastien Fekete, who's a wildlife program lead for the government, for government and industry relations with the Mikisew Cree First Nation. His experience lies in consultation and project management, advocating for sustainable development in the energy sector, and for the protection of MCFN's treaty and Aboriginal rights. Welcome, Sebastien. It's great to have you both with us.
Perfect. Thank you, Amanda.
Great. So I hand the reins over to you. And if people have questions, I'd ask that you just hold on to them to the end. We'll, as I said, we'll have lots of time at the end of these presentations to get into your questions. So mark them down, and we'll see you in a bit. I'll give you guys a quick signal when you've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Thanks for the great introductions. And thank you for all of you for joining us to learn about our Indigenous Woodland Caribou Stewardship Plan, or as we like to call it, the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk Stewardship Plan. As Amanda mentioned, my name is Laurie Cyprien. I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, or ACFN. This is my colleague Sebastien. He is from the Mikisew Cree First Nation, or MCFN. We also have some other members of the team in attendance, and you'll see them later on in the panel. We have Susan Leech from Firelight, that was a big member of helping us put this together. Lindsay Wong from MCFN and Brian Fung from ACFN. We all worked as a great team to establish the stewardship plan. ACFN and MCFN traditional territory is located in northeastern Alberta, Canada, and is home to many ungulate species, including the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk. ACFN and MCFN came together because we realized that Canada and Alberta are just not doing enough to protect the caribou, and it was up to us, the Indigenous communities, to create a plan. With pressure and negotiation, Canada provided funding for this initiative, and we're very happy to be able to share it with you today. Next slide, please. We'll now play a recording from our elders and knowledge holders.
We have to step outside the box and go back to what our ancestors did in order to get this right. So I think that's where we got inherent rights and treaty signing and oral history.
Through our Dené and Cree laws, we have maintained our stewardship for the land through ceremonies, teachings, oral tradition. So that would establish our old ways.
The real oral history is that we always preserved. We never took more than we needed.
This whole project is for us to create awareness, to work together, and to respect each other, to honor each other, and speak with humility, because that's our sacred teachings.
Thank you. We can move on to the next slide. Our nations, ACFN and MCFN, are sovereign nations of our homelands, and as government have authority over our homelands. Our people have been responsible for stewarding the lands and waters of our homelands in northeastern Alberta and taking care of the values that are critical to our cultural way of life. Our homelands must be managed through our Dené and Cree oral and written laws, through using our natural laws of the land and our stewardship protocols. Next slide, please. Canada is a signatory to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they have committed to protecting at least 17% of terrestrial areas and inland water, recovering populations of species at risk, conservation and enhancement of Canada's wetlands, ensuring Aboriginal traditional knowledge is respected, promoted, and informing biodiversity conservation and management decision-making, and to meet their 2030 emission reduction plan. Even with these commitments made by the Government of Canada, Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk populations continue to decline. Wetland habitat continues to be impacted and lost, and legislation and regulations are doing very little to stop these losses. Next slide, please. Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk are a culturally keystone species that plays a central role in both Dené and Cree way of life. They are an integral part of our food and cultural systems, and their importance cannot be overstated. Now we'll play a recording of our elders and knowledge holders speaking to the importance of caribou.
Caribou is very important to us because it's been part of our traditional territory. We've had access to caribou since time immemorial, and over time with the industry and the landscape and the disturbances, we've lost almost all the caribou.
Caribou is our Dené culture. They're nomadic. They move around just like us, so we have that connection with them because the Dené people were nomadic people as well.
What I think about caribou, that they're a food source for the Denisot people, including myself and my family. We use caribou to help sustain us, and we did for thousands of years. Personally, I follow our oral history and respect our elders, and our elders say not to hunt them because their numbers are low until they repopulate. but it feeds our people. It makes drums. We use the meat for pemmican. We make dry meat, and those are the things that myself and my family enjoy.
Thank you. So very true. All those statements are what my family, my community, we all live by those, and hope that we can continue to. So this map shows the herd ranges within the Caribou Stewardship Plan, along with the different land uses present, with pinks, purples, and grays being oil and gas, and yellow being forestry. As you can see from the map, that shows the extent of development in northeastern Alberta. Caribou populations are being pushed to the brink of extirpation in northeastern Alberta, and their ranges have very low levels of undisturbed habitat within them, with most have showing steep declines since the 2000s. Caribou in Canada are protected as a threatened species under the Federal Species at Risk Act. In 2012, Canada released a recovery strategy for the boreal population of woodland caribou, which identified critical habitat and delegated the requirement to develop range plans to protect critical habitat in the provinces and territories. Critical habitat is defined as 65% of each range maintained in an undisturbed condition at all times. 65% of each range maintained in an undisturbed condition at all times. Most jurisdictions have not yet finalized effective range plans to protect critical habitat, and the government of Alberta's approach to range planning is flawed, as it does not recognize the unique rights and interests held by Indigenous communities. It does not have an imminent means to protect current intact habitat and prevent further degradation, takes a prohibitively long time to achieve the target of 65% undisturbed habitat, and does not provide a mechanism for both Indigenous knowledge and Western science to be used together to make management decisions about the land. None of the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk ranges in Alberta meets this 65% habitat condition threshold, which highlights the need for a strong, legally enforceable plan to protect and restore caribou habitat. Next slide, please. As part of the development of this plan, we needed to engage with the community earlier on to make sure that the plan was informed and guided by the two communities. In October of 2020, we held 2 workshops with elders and knowledge holders from both communities to give us direction for the process of putting together this stewardship plan. We also had 2 on-the-land visits with elders and knowledge holders and interviews to gather Indigenous knowledge on key knowledge gaps related to Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk, including cultural uses, sightings, habitat use throughout the seasons, input on the proposed zones for the stewardship plan, management actions, information about impacts, and how to restore habitat. We wanted to hear from the people exactly what they're seeing and how we can help. They are the knowledge holders. They know how we can bring them back and what we need to do. In April and June of 2021, we held virtual verification sessions with elders and knowledge holders to verify the goals, principles, management strategies, and general approach of this stewardship plan. In August of 2022, we went on a 5-day camp with elders. So much fun to be out on the land with for 5 days. We had knowledge holders, elders, and youth. They shared knowledge and direction related to the caribou conservation, range planning, habitat restoration approaches, and developed an elders declaration. I think we've got the most information being together, all of us, both ACFN and MCFN, while we were out on the land. The stories came, people are more open, they're more relaxed. We're in our traditional territory. Next slide, please. What we heard from the elders and knowledge holders is that the stewardship plan needs to follow natural Dené Cree laws and stewardship protocols. These laws include, but are not limited to, the 7 generations, respecting family group areas, protecting cultural keystone areas, sharing resources, and taking only what you need. We have an Elders Declaration as a statement of authority for all governments and organizations to understand ACFN and MCFN rights and responsibilities to steward our homelands and everything within it. And that other governments need to share, follow, and enforce their laws in accordance with these Dené and Cree laws. All other parts of the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk Stewardship Plan will stem from these laws. Stewardship protocols and Elders Declaration. Knowledge holders identify that caribou populations and habitat need to be replenished, meaning return to their original state, and that all of the currently isolated local populations within each range will need to be maintained and restored. Now we'll play a recording of our elders and knowledge holders speaking to the importance of the need for this stewardship plan and action plan.
We don't do nothing. This heart that we have here, it's going to be broken one day. And we're going to be all lost and wondering why we didn't fight harder or spoke out harder. Once you take all that muskeg away, there's going to be no caribou. That's the ones keep the wolves and the bears and everything under control so they don't eat their calves.
How we recognize that Indigenous knowledge has to drive this plan that we're trying to implement, you know.
Now the newer generation and our elders that are guiding us, we could move a lot faster now than we ever did before if we all got together and sat and be as one in our heart. We all have the same heart and the same blood.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So now that we've heard this knowledge, we needed to put a technical team together that would follow the Elders Land Users Youth guidance, which include the approach focused on documenting Indigenous knowledge to understand better the relationships between caribou and a healthy boreal ecosystem, and mapping high priority areas for implementing habitat protection and restoration. Western science data and knowledge were used to inform development of the plan, including available telemetry data and habitat suitability mapping. Indigenous knowledge and Western science was used on equal footing, allowing the strengths of both knowledge systems to be drawn on. Equal footing, both Western science and traditional knowledge. The team considered other values in the planning, including important cultural and spiritual areas, industrial disturbance information, important access corridors and economic values, to develop a plan that maximizes the benefit for Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk and attempts to minimize conflict with industrial development. Next slide, please. From the guidance from the elders and knowledge holders came the following goal for the stewardship plan. Recover caribou populations to the extent that ACFN and MCFN can once again rely on caribou for subsistence and cultural practices. This full goal must be met in no longer than 40 years, with measurable and verified progress being achieved in set periods within that timeline. To meet this goal, knowledge holders identified a target of 80% undisturbed habitat with caribou ranges by 2061, with calving habitats targeted at 100% disturbance-free. In addition to being disturbance-free, this habitat must contain all the qualities required by Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk to meet their needs throughout each season. Please note this last statement is about a biophysical component of critical habitat. It's not enough to just be undisturbed habitat. It needs to be the right kind of habitat of undisturbed, so caribou can survive and thrive. Next slide, please. As well, based on the guidance, came the following principles for the stewardship plan. ACFN and MCFN inherent rights and oral treaty signing must be included in any actions to recover Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk populations and habitat. Ongoing planning for Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk recovery needs to be guided by the knowledge of the two nations. Indigenous knowledge must be held at equal weight to Western science within the range planning process. There needs to be enough habitat to protect, to support healthy caribou populations and a healthy environment. This includes restoring disturbed habitat and protecting intact habitat, particularly habitat that contains the qualities required by Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk to meet their needs throughout each season. Next slide, please. Woodland caribou are a migratory species, and all the local populations were historically interconnected. There should be equal priority and protection for all caribou ranges in Alberta. Caribou population numbers cycle over time with habitat availability. This cycle should be maintained by ensuring sufficient, appropriate, and connected habitat is available to support healthy caribou populations. Next slide, please. The elders and knowledge holders provided guidance on the 4 core actions that comprise the plan. Developing an elders declaration to guide the recovery of caribou using Dené and Cree oral and written laws. Identifying stewardship zones in the study area to ensure that the habitat targets outlined in the stewardship plan goal can be met. Establishing a guardianship program to support knowledge gathering, intergenerational knowledge transmission, and stewardship of caribou in our homelands. And developing stewardship protocols based on Dené and Cree knowledge to guide all governments, industry, and other organizations working in Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk habitat in our homelands. So that's my part. I did the first part. Sebastian's going to do the next part, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lori. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth on those core actions. So the first core action that we undertook was the development of the Elders Declaration, which was developed during the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk camp and finally completed in April 2023. The declaration is a legal document based on Dené and Cree laws, and it is the expectation of both the ACFN and MCFN that it be followed by all external governments, organizations, and industry working within our homelands. The declaration highlights values and provides a vision of how to manage woodland caribou in culturally appropriate ways. The declaration describes the authority, jurisdiction, rights, and responsibilities of the ACFN and MCFN in regards to the stewardship of Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk. The declaration's purpose is to inform the standards for Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk management based on our values, Dené and Cree laws, and as well as our stewardship protocols. Next slide. The second core action that we undertook is the stewardship zones. To develop these zones, elders and knowledge holders identified that some of the landscape must remain free of disturbance to allow for Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk to move around the landscape as they once have and to meet their different seasonal needs. Based on this guidance, we identified stewardship zones that show which areas should be protected and restored in order to recover their ranges. In order to delineate these areas, we used information from different sources, including IK or Indigenous knowledge shared by our elders and land users, specifically on where Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk are found, and important areas, which would include things like winter habitat or calving grounds. We also took into consideration Western science like telemetry data and critical habitat data. We also took into consideration disturbance data, parks, and protected area boundaries. We then used a conservation planning software, MarkSand, to compile all the data and information and summarize that data by planning blocks in order to identify stewardship zones in the landscape based on rules identified by our team and IK advisors during the community engagement sessions that we held. Some of these rules include ensuring that at least 65% of the landscape within each range is protected or restored, and protecting areas with high numbers of woodland caribou habitat that can meet all of their seasonal needs and that show low levels of disturbance and few industrial leases or tenure. Okay, so over here we have a map. These stewardship zones provide the foundation for all actions that need to be taken and will inform the actions of the stewardship protocols. The stewardship zones include protection zones, which are shown in green on the map here, restoration zones, which are shown in yellow, and active management zones, which are depicted in red, with at least 65% of the landscape within each range being designated as either a protection or restoration zone. Next slide. Now we'll go through a more in-depth look at these 3 stewardship zones and see some of the data that was used to build these out. In this map, you could see a zoom in of the protection zone in green, with parks and protected areas in dark green and human disturbance in black. So as we can see, there's a lot of lines. These are all seismic lines. In the next slide. So in this map, you can see the addition of wildfires in orange, showing that the protection zone was actually significantly impacted by wildfires. And in this map, you can see the buffers around human disturbances, showing just how much habitat is taken up, and that the most intact habitat is in the protection zones. So we went through this process iteratively for the other stewardship zones as well. So the way these zones have been laid out, there's obviously a higher level of percentage of protection in the north, while the southern region has more restoration zones present, as these areas are highly disturbed and encumbered by industrial activity. It's important to mention that the active management zone still needs to be managed using best practices, which will allow for caribou to persist in these areas nonetheless. So what do these management zones actually mean in practice? So for the protection zones, they're actually the best remaining caribou habitat, and they need to be protected. In this zone, any remaining industrial leases or other encumbrances need to be removed over time so that they could be fully protected, with the goal of having protection within 10 years. It's an ambitious goal, but one that we plan on working with our partners with. In the restoration zone, these are actually areas that are important habitat for Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk, but they do have higher levels of disturbance than the areas in the protection zone and are encumbered by industrial leases. A lot of work needs to happen here. We need to do active restoration of these zones, and we need to remove industrial encumbrances over time, eventually with the goal of protecting them. Finally, in the active management zone, it's the last zone that we identified within the stewardship plan. The active management zones do have high levels of industry, and it is our understanding and expectation that, yes, new industrial disturbances are permitted within this zone, but activities need to drive net improvements elsewhere through offsetting and restoration. You know, we don't consider these zones a write-off by any stretch of the imagination. We do need habitat to improve here. So active management using the principles and the stewardship protocols is absolutely necessary. The third core action is guardianship. As part of the stewardship plan, boots on the ground monitoring needs to be implemented through a guardians program. That guardians program is led by our elders and knowledge holders and follows our Dené and Cree laws. It is guided by our stewardship values and protocols and needs to involve our community members, including youth. It is our expectation that by having boots on the ground, they'll be in a better position to inform protection measures and even participate in offsetting or restoration activities. Another important component of this is really active youth involvement to allow for youth to reconnect to the land and so that cultural values are passed on with regards to woodland caribou. The fourth core action that we undertook is the development of our stewardship protocols, which are in place to protect our inherent rights as well as our treaty rights as properly understood. The stewardship protocols are being documented by Dené and Cree knowledge holders from our oral traditions and will be released formally in the future and will include things such as training material on cultural protocols, guidance for how organizations and government must work with Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk habitat, tenure management, restoration standards, offsetting calculator, and wildlife management. All governments and organizations, including industry, working within our homelands will need to follow these stewardship protocols that honor our beliefs and values protected by our natural laws. So why is this the plan that should be followed? It's a good question. So implementing this plan has multiple benefits and is an investment in natural climate change solutions and meets many of the specific targets outlined in the 2020 biodiversity goals and targets and the 2030 plan for climate change. Specifically, it addresses shortcomings of current range planning documents put forward by the government of Alberta by recognizing the unique rights and interests held by our Indigenous communities, identifying immediate means to protect culturally intact habitat and prevent further degradation of habitat by designating areas as off limits to development and prioritizing restoration, and achieving at least 65% undisturbed habitat in a much quicker time frame of 40 years, rather than, for example, the Wandering River Range Plan, which is set to achieve that target in 100 years. It also provides a mechanism for both Indigenous knowledge and Western science to create sound planning and management actions. As well, it helps to meet Canada's international commitments related to biodiversity and climate change by helping to achieve the target of protecting at least 17% of terrestrial areas and inland waters, helping to recover the at-risk listed Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk, helping to restore, protect, and manage boreal peatlands, and ensuring that Indigenous knowledge is effectively informing biodiversity conservation and management. Finally, protecting, restoring, and enhancing boreal wetland and peatland, allowing for greater levels of carbon sequestration. Importantly, the implementation of the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk Stewardship Plan is seen by both of our nations as a fundamental component of reconciliation between the Crown and the ACFN and MCFN. So while a lot of this background work has been done, we recognize that there's still a lot of work to be completed as next steps. So those next steps include the implementation of the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk Stewardship Plan, and it will require that all levels of government, industry partners, and funding organizations in order for the goals to be achieved. The actions that will need to take place over the next 2 years include refining the stewardship zones to ensure protection and restoration actions are achievable, and the goals and objectives of the plan are attainable. We have to meet with both our federal and provincial government counterparts to identify viable approaches for implementing the stewardship zones, and rebuilding and refining the guardianship and monitoring programs to actively monitor management outcomes and contribute actively to restoration projects. We must also work with the province and industry to action management measures within the restoration zones. And finally, we must take actions to finalize the stewardship protocols, including securing funding to develop and deliver cultural training for parties working within our homelands, finalizing the restoration standard and offsetting calculator and piloting these with industry partners, and establishing a wildlife management board with Indigenous communities and organizations to help manage Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk. Next slide. Recently, we've been focusing on finishing the restoration standard and offsetting calculator through the completion of workshops with knowledge holders and getting guidance from Dené and Cree perspectives. This includes getting details on how much offsetting is required under different development scenarios. So based on where disturbance is happening, how much of the disturbance is happening and for how long, these are all factors that we're going to consider when determining the amount of offsetting that is required for specific projects. Now we're also working to finalize these and prepare a package for industry guidance and adding these appendices to the Tâdzié-Sagow Atihk Stewardship Plan. Final slide. So now we'll end the presentation with some final thoughts from our elders and knowledge holders.
Caribou, it has a great significance to not just myself and my family, but to the Aboriginal groups, First Nation groups in the area, because it's one of the key species that'll tell you the health of the area, right? It's like muskrat is in the delta. And, you know, you got abundant of muskrat, you got abundant of animals that feed on the muskrat, and the whole cycle that, you know, is the muskrat's a key species that supports other animals. Same with the caribou in the area. It's a great key species because it tells you the health of the forest, because the abundance of caribou will tell you that there's a lot of availability of food in the forest that could sustain the caribou. If there's a lot of caribou, that means the forest, the whole ecosystem is healthy. It's part of our connection to the land. It's not just the killing and the eating of the caribou, but when you go hunting caribou, it's the enjoyment of the beauty of the land that you got to go through to get to the caribou. Mm-hmm. So it's the exercise you got to get to the caribou. Get a good healthy caribou, bring it home, feed your family, the pride of a hunter as a provider to your family.
We have to protect the caribou because at one point in time the caribou fed us and kept us healthy and thrived, you know, and just because we are thriving in a different way doesn't mean that we have to abandon the caribou and forget about them. The Dené and the caribou are one, and that's how we survive, and that's how we'll always be one.
Caribou means to me healthy ecosystems, healthy lands. I want to be able to bring my kids on traditional territory and harvest caribou in the future.
And I guess that wraps up the interesting recordings there. I hope you guys enjoyed that.
Well, a big thank you. Yeah, Lori, did you have a last word?
No, I think that that wrapped it up beautifully. We had voices from elders and youth there on the last slide, to really bring home the importance of the caribou to our nations.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic presentation, and I really enjoyed the voices, especially those last ones. Very powerful to hear about that special relationship between your people and the caribou. And a great addition to the webinar. That's the first time I've seen that done, so thank you. So we're going to be shifting gears now into the panel discussion portion of this. I would just highlight for anyone who's interested in the chat there, Kristen, maybe you can repost it if you want to read the rest of that report. I mean, you just did a fantastic summary of it, but of course there's much more in the written report. You can access it on their website. So Kristen, if you could just repost that in the chat so it's easily accessible for folks. And yeah, so we've got a number of other panelists joining our presenters now. I'll just introduce them quickly so you have a sense of who they are. So Brian Fung is the Manager of Government Relations, Dené Lands and Resource Management for the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. Susan Leech is Research Director and Technical Lead with the Ecology Team at the Firelight Group, which is an Indigenous-owned consulting company. And Lindsay Wong is the Manager of Environmental Affairs at the Mikisew Cree First Nation. So welcome to the panel, all of you. So while you were speaking, so I would welcome people just to say how we're going to run this part. We'd love to hear questions from the audience. So please use the hand raising icon. I think you should all be familiar with that now, but if you're not, I believe it's in, where is the hand? Maybe I don't have one because you should have a hand raising icon. I'm just going to assume that you all know how to do that because we live in the Zoom room now, a lot of us. So please raise your hand. The alternative is to put your question into the chat. So we've already got one question there that I will ask Kristen to read momentarily. But first, I'd like to invite Robin, who raised his hand earlier, to ask the first question. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you. Sorry, I was late. I was having trouble getting in. I didn't know where the email was for this meeting, and I had trouble finding it. Anyways, I'm here now, and I really enjoyed that presentation. There's a lot of things there that you mentioned that we could use in our efforts to do penning of caribou. We're in a region where, relatively speaking, the population is quite high, and we selected that area for our penning project, and the province is now at our doorstep, knocking on the door. We met with them once, and it seems like that they want to work with us. I mean, that's what they say, but I'm kind of hesitant to say, okay, we'll work with you, until they lay out what they want to do for us. So it's the relationship between the First Nations and Saskatchewan has never been good. So we're going into this with that in mind. But the thing I liked about your proposal is, and I do have a question about one of those areas, the stewardship areas. Do you plan on telling the First Nations in that region to stop hunting in that area? Has there been any kind of dialogue around that?
I could take that. Thanks, Robin. It's really nice to hear that you have a high population of caribou. But no, we haven't shared with, so Mikisew and ACFN are in the same area, and I think that we just know as Indigenous people that we're not hunting to try to increase the population. We haven't actually put out a directive or anything. And as for other nations, maybe further south, we haven't spoken to them directly yet regarding the stewardship plan, but they are aware. And I feel like we do have a lot of conversation about buffalo in that shared territory. So as a side note, we've kind of brought it up as well, that the populations are low and that we should refrain from harvesting at this time until the numbers go up. So nothing really formal, but definitely informal conversations have happened. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Robin, for your question. I would just ask that folks just quickly introduce themselves as you come up on the screen. So next we have Jim. Jim, I'm just going to add you to the screen here so we can see you. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Jim Webb. I'm a policy advisor for the Little Red River Cree Nation, which has 3 communities on the west side of Wood Buffalo National Park. I put some information in the chat frame identifying the fact that we have a 10,000 square kilometer forest tenure. It's situated underneath the Caribou Mountain Wildland Park, which we helped to create in 2002 to protect the Caribou Mountain herd. And it contains a large part of the remaining tenure for the Caribou Mountain caribou herd in our forest tenure F23. The south end of our forest tenure is part of the red earth herd, as shown on your maps. And we're talking actively with both Alberta and with Wood Buffalo about the notion that if you're going to do a protection and recovery strategy for the red earth herd, that you might want to look at the southwest quadrant of Wood Buffalo National Park, which is critical caribou habitat and is articulated to both our forest tenure, which we're trying to turn into a forest conservation management area, and to the wildland parks situated immediately to the south. Our forest tenure is also focused on trying to recover bison herds in the context that we have extreme food security needs in our communities. The moose populations have crashed. Little Red members have not been hunting caribou since we began working to protect the Caribou Mountain wildlands in the 1990s. And that's a initiative that was prompted by our elders. We're working with MSES, which is a consulting firm, and with the University of Saskatchewan with David Natcher. And we would really like to talk with you, ACFN and Mikisew, about a collaborative approach to this Wood Buffalo National Park initiative.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks, Jim. Did you? Go ahead, Lori.
Oh yeah, I'd say we do a lot of collaboration with your folks, Jim, when it comes to the action plan work. So cooperative management committee, all of those things. So I think that we were open up for a discussion, definitely to expand our protection areas for caribou. So I think our contact information is going to become available to you.
If you want,
yeah, if you could give them our contact for email, phone, our cell phone number, I think that we can connect, Jim. Absolutely. Thanks for that.
I think Brian's already shared his email address. If anybody else would like to share their information in the chat for participants, that would be great. Yeah, I don't see any other hands up. Again, I encourage you, if you have a question, to either put it, raise your hand. It's under the reactions button. Thank you for the person who clarified that for me. Just click on the raise hand. Otherwise, you can pop your question into the chat. Kristen, I believe you have a question for our panelists.
Yep, so there was one that came through the chat earlier just asking, so they say that woodland caribou is not migratory, but maybe the elders have a different view on this. I know, Lori, you mentioned in your presentation that the caribou are more migratory in your area. So the person was just asking if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. So I think migratory is just moving from one location to the next, right? So our herd will move to the best habitat. So we've heard, if there's a forest fire in one area, those caribou is going to move. If a really dry year, they're going to move to another area. So the elders, land users, kind of have seen that pattern. Depending on the particular year and what's happening in nature, they will have to probably look somewhere else. So we, for caribou migratory, it's seasonally, it's disturbance for where we would find them in the different ranges. They may be higher, they may be lower, depending, like Birch Mountain area or down in the valley, just depending on what's happening. So that's kind of, how we look at everything very holistically. So that's another just part of one of our Dené laws and Cree laws is to listen to the land, listen to Mother Nature, and go from there.
Great. Kristen has another question for you.
Yeah, and we're just going to do John's first because I know he has to leave shortly. So he's asking, have the two First Nations use Section 11 agreements under the Species at Risk Act in your work?
I'll let Brian take that one.
Sure. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So the short answer is yes, we have, John. ACFN and MCFN joined or entered into a Section 11 agreement with Canada in March of 2022 with some pretty specific deliverables, of which the stewardship plan is one of them. And so we have been using that as a bit of a vehicle to progress on some of these caribou kind of recovery objectives. We're right now internally still figuring out, we're meeting with Canada on the Section 11 agreement that's coming up. It's going to be expiring in March of 2024. So we're kind of looking at, the efficacy, whether that's the right mechanism, whether it's the right tool, whether it gives us the leverage necessary to continue the work. But again, in short, yes, we have entered into species at risk Section 11 agreements.
So we have another question here that came into the chat from Lynn Palmer. So she asks, how is or will the plan being recognized, upheld by the Alberta government? And has there been any response from them yet?
I can also take a first crack at this one here, and Sebastien and Lindsay from MCFN, if you want to kind of chime in as well. So Alberta mainly uses their sub-regional planning processes for the kind of caribou work. And so we've preliminarily been involved on those sub-regional planning processes. I think Sebastien mentioned the Wandering River sub-regional planning process. So a part of that touches on some of the herd ranges here that are in the stewardship plan. So principally, that's been our input. There hasn't been anything formal in terms of Alberta accepting the plan. The best we've kind of gotten to date is Alberta willing to take a look at inputs in their sub-regional processes that may include parts of our plan. So that's kind of where it's at. We're still working through that process. They're starting the Wabasca sub-regional planning process soon, and others will follow. And so as those come up, we'll see how they develop and whether they become, appropriate mechanisms and ways in which we can advance this work. Thank you. And Sebastien and Lindsay, I open the floor if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, maybe I could chime in here. Thanks, Brian. So yeah, we've definitely had some discussions, preliminary discussions, I would say, with Alberta on this, and I think that there's at least broad level recognition and acceptance of the stewardship plan, and I feel that there's definitely more conversations that need to take place on this, but our feeling at the outset of our interaction is that there's definitely some interest in moving forward on some of the things that we put forward in the stewardship plan, and very preliminarily we've entered in conversations with the provincial government on undertaking some joint collaborative efforts on some restoration of some seismic lines within some of the zones that we identified in the stewardship plan. Those are conversations that are still in progress, so nothing formalized has been established. However, there's the intent to move forward on collaboratively restoring some of the seismic lines within some of those zones. So those are conversations to be continued. Lindsay, I don't know, do you have anything else to add specifically to this?
Sorry. Yeah, I think what we'd be looking for from the Alberta government more specifically is support on our offsetting calculator and restoration standards. It's great that we'd be able to partner on future work, but having stricter regulations for restoration would be great, because right now we'd have to rely on the goodwill of proponents to undertake restoration, and we haven't had too much of an opportunity yet to pilot some of our strategies, but that is definitely something we'd like to be working towards.
Okay, we have another question come in through the chat that kind of builds off that one. So the person wants to know, what is, if you know, Alberta's stance on legal pluralism with First Nations?
So I'm not just very high level legal pluralism. I think for anyone who doesn't know, is just the existence of different legal systems and kind of how they interact. So the short answer there, Morris, I believe where the question came from, is from ACFN's perspective, Alberta has not recognized any sort of another legal system. We have discussions that kind of talk about various aspects of that, but I think broadly, in terms of just kind of the judicial landscape across Canada, there's a growing movement to recognize kind of Indigenous law in some of these processes, but I don't think we're quite there yet, and I would hazard saying we're definitely not there yet in the Alberta context. So that's what I'll leave that with. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up question, then we'll turn to Jim. But I'm curious if you know, Brian, who's I imagine the AFN is leading the charge on that kind of work to recognize legal pluralism, but it's definitely something that comes up in many contexts. I'm just wondering, if people want to learn more about that, where would they find more information?
That is a great question, and one I don't have an answer to. But maybe if we can dig into it a little bit more, we can send it out in the distribution list. So if anybody is interested, they can follow up with that.
Great, thank you. Again, we've got a bit of time ahead of us, so if anyone has questions, please raise your hand. I've got Jim again, so go ahead, Jim.
Yes. I live at West Moberly in Northeast BC, and we have a partnership agreement with Canada and the government of BC that's grounded in a federal position that says not only do caribou have to be recovered and their habitats protected to ensure their sustainability, but those habitats and recovery efforts must be sufficient to meet the food security needs of West Moberly and Saugw First Nations. So that is unique in the context of Treaty 8, because we have a provincial government now that has accepted its fiduciary duty to protect the way of life. Have you talked in your discussions with Canada about how willing they are to advocate for this position in relation to Alberta, which does not accept this notion?
So again, I'll take this one on here. So in our conversations with Canada, I'll say no. We have not advocated or had that conversation, Jim. I think our focus with Canada has been, and I'm sorry, the sensors have just gone off in this room here and that I'm in. I think that our focus has really been kind of understanding what Canada's role is in ensuring that the recovery goals are met, whatever that looks like and how that looks like with Alberta. So no, we haven't. And actually, I'd love for us to connect, Jim, and I think we will following this. If you can crystallize kind of that position on how that's working with West Moberly, I think it'd be really interesting for us to bring that to the table with Canada and saying, hey, how do we work this type of perspective when we don't have a very friendly provincial government, or as friendly a provincial government, let's say. And so very interested in hearing more about that, Jim, and looking to converse further on that.
Great, thank you.
I noticed that there was a hand up earlier from Abdullah. I'm not sure if that's
he put his hand down, so we're just going to turn to a few.
Oh, hi. I raised hand, but I'll put it down because some other participant has essentially have more important topic to discuss in here. So the reason I was trying to speak, the idea of thinking like caribou is migratory or not migratory, this question was coming to us all the time. When we hear from the sciences, caribou is not migratory, that doesn't actually fit with the indigenous way of knowing, because it is always a situation they are going like a blanket from one place to another. And the elders actually, if I talk about the Cree elders at Northern Saskatchewan, they are always telling that they will come back. They will come back. So they have a belief with this caribou culturally. They believe that way. So there is no way to believe in one thinking like what scientists say. So this is why I brought this topic, if it is a relevant topic to discuss. Thank you so much, Lori, to elaborate on this. And definitely you will see the situation I was discussing in the last meeting, that there are good habitat. Caribou is not there. Caribou are not there either way. So elders have a different understanding that why caribou would not be there. They say that they have left this habitat to find something else in the other area. And the good habitat, there is no caribou, then this is how, if we try to interpret that, okay, we will do this digging and we will do the forestry there because there is no caribou, this is a good stand. So, the economic way of thinking, that type of different views, something put the indigenous communities in a very difficult situation. So This is why I was so glad to see that, hear from Lori, that at least she has brought an additional information that we can think about, like whether the science is not always true, and definitely this is, we try to see this thing in a separate way.
Thanks.
So thank you so much, Lori.
That's great. Go ahead, Lori.
No, I just wanted to say thanks. Yeah. Thanks for that comment.
But I do think he brings up an interesting point that I was also wondering about, which is, if you foresee, or if you've already had pushback against your plan. I mean, where I saw a distinction, right, was, I think you mentioned that your communities recognize these four, what the government recognizes as four herds, as actually members of one herd that have been split. And I'm just curious if that and the point that Mamoun raised, how having these different understandings of what is between Western science and Indigenous science, how that plays out in your work.
I don't think we've had any really pushback, but not a lot of people have really been able to grasp the stewardship plan yet. They were knocking on our door before we were able to finalize it. So it is out there now. Nobody's approached us to further explain anything that I know of yet. And we are working, like Sebastien mentioned, about the I lost the word. The calculator.
Restoration standards and offset calculator.
Thank you. The restoration standard calculator. So we're now going to, and I think this might be a first for some people. We see your issue that you've created for us, and now we're weaving or joining the traditional knowledge and Western science together to come up with solutions for you to fix it now. So they can't say we don't know how to do it. We've gotten the knowledge from our members. We've taken, the Western science portion, and now we're handing them a beautiful document to say, now go. This is how you need to do it. And if you need help doing that, we're here to get onto the ground, boots on the ground to help put it back as well. So I don't know any really big pushback from it.
Yeah, and I would add to Laurie's point as well. Working government relations, I can probably admit to having a pretty jaded outlook in some of our conversations with them. However, I will say, Amanda, broadly, that there is a recognition and acceptance of the place and appropriateness of Indigenous knowledge in these processes now, both at the federal and provincial level. So we are seeing, in my estimation, kind of a shift where, there is a recognition that it's necessary, and it is a massive gap that Western science hasn't been able to fill, or doesn't fill adequately. And so slowly, to that point, there hasn't been a whole lot of pushback, like Laurie said, and I'm in fact seeing certain people and groups wanting to roll it in and looking and coming to us for some of that information and some of that input. So just to add to what Laurie said there. Thanks.
Well, that's a very promising, I'm curious to know if others feel like that shift has occurred in their context. You can just drop a little note in the chat, because this is something that, it's a hard thing to track, right? Is people's government, civil servants in particular's attitudes or openness or lack thereof to the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. And it's great to hear from your perspective that things have indeed shifted over the last few years. Okay, Kristen, I think you have some more. Oh, please. Sure. Yeah.
It's just, I often find that these debates kind of pin the two knowledge systems against each other. So you have Western science versus Indigenous knowledge, and I find they're two knowledge systems that are often more complementary than not. And it's just that sometimes there's gaps in Western science that are just understood from the Indigenous knowledge side through experience on the land, through having been there for millennia. And so sometimes it's just a question of having Western science catch up to what has already been known and experienced from knowledge holders. And so I find that there's a lot of benefit in having the dialogue between Western science and Indigenous knowledge to have a better comprehension on the issues that are taking place. That's just it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sebastien. And I'd like to say that, we take this Indigenous knowledge, and I do a lot of research for our nation. And my big thing is the Indigenous knowledge is core. So it's first, and then we sprinkle in the Western science. So I think that's how we did a lot of this work as well. We talk to them, we go to where the areas that they say they want to go, and then we kind of set up our monitoring programs or whatever around that. So I think if we, people start doing that going forward, I think we would have, fantastic results on all levels of natural resource research.
Absolutely. Yeah, great visions, both of you, all of you on that. Thank you. We've got a few more questions in the chat from Kristen, and Mamoun, we'll come back around to you if there's time. So I'd like to just prioritize people who haven't had a chance to ask their questions yet. Over to you, Kristen.
So there's another one here from Morris, and I think you basically just spoke to this, but he's asking if you can explain a little more on the framework for weaving together knowledge systems in the plan and what tools are being used. So I don't know if you have anything more to say on that subject, but I'll just give you.
Well, I could talk a long time on that, but yeah, to sum it up, like it's hard. Depending, I think that you have to you don't want to lose the core of the knowledge holders' knowledge as well, right? So I'd say start with that, work your Western science piece around it, and be sure that you're not using it as a verification. It's to further enhance that Western science. You're not using Western science to verify the Indigenous knowledge, because that I don't think you'll have a successful outcome that way. So it's a lot of talking, one-on-one interviews on the land. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that bringing people together on the land and having a camp out and cooking outside and just connecting. I feel like we got so much information just by doing that, and those side conversations after supper at tea, like I feel like that was a really big success portion for us, is having that Caribou camp with all of our elders, land users, and youth. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just add, Laurie, and it's further to kind of what Sebastien said earlier, but it's really deconstructing this idea that Western science and Indigenous knowledge operate in isolation and are kind of like butting heads against one another, right? There's some sort of a problem or some sort of an issue that is being looked at, and Western science and Indigenous knowledge have a part to play in filling in all the gaps in knowledge. So I think it's really shifting mindsets to being more open to the types of knowledge that are incorporated into initiatives. Because from the Western science side, you hear stories, and there's all sorts of assumptions that go on in people's minds on what that means. But really, stories is just observational science over time that is being carried on and updated every time there's a knowledge user who lives their whole life out on the land, reports it, right? And so, and I'll just share just a super quick little story here on my side. We had an exercise, and Laurie was a part of this, and maybe others in the group as well, on the Ronald Lake buffalo herd, where we talked about this kind of interweaving story. And it was so interesting for me to see some Western scientists come to the realization, oh, actually, I have textbooks on my shelf about a certain subject from 10 years ago that isn't relevant anymore because the story has changed about that subject, even from a Western science kind of approach. So it isn't different. And I think it's really important to, again, just shift our perspective on the types of knowledge and the ways we incorporate that into these processes. Thanks.
Fantastic. Hey, Kristen, go ahead.
Sorry, just to add in, I think another good thing that Indigenous knowledge was able to fill in was the big picture principles and going back to Dené and Cree laws. That's like a huge thing, because I find that when you look at government regulations or documents, they're like extremely prescriptive about what needs to be done. But if you go back to the heart of it, to the Dené and Cree principles, and you're adhering to those things right off the bat, then we're already in a better place to jumpstart caribou population recovery and habitat restoration. So it is, like everyone else says, it's changing your mindset and being able to incorporate different types.
Beautiful. Sounds like you guys could write a book on this. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, Kristen, I think we have a couple other questions.
So there's one that came through the chat from Tom, and he's asking if there's a timeline on when the restoration standard will be released. I guess he's interested in learning more about that.
I think Susan is part of the panel, right? Maybe
speak
we'll
to
defer
that.
to you on that one.
So our aim is to have a final version in the hands of this team by early December. And so then we have some internal review to do, and it would be hopefully something that we're looking at having some guidance on that is available for industry starting in the new year. So that's where we're aiming.
We'll have to have another presentation when that comes out by the sounds of it. Okay, great. Kristen, any other questions?
Yeah, there's one here. So how did you get this process off the ground? And what are some lessons learned that could help other First Nations who are thinking of doing something similar?
So I can take a first crack at this one. How did we get the process started on the ground? Really, it was us suing the government for not protecting caribou. That was the start of it. So, you know, we were approached by EcoJustice and AWA and the David Suzuki Foundation to launch litigation against the federal government for not meeting its obligations under SARA, under the Species at Risk Act. And so all of that resulted and kind of kickstarted this process of Canada settling, providing capacity to nations to actually create an action plan, a work plan for concrete deliverables that ultimately are going to help protect caribou. And then that process kind of just developed, and then, you know, the nations looked at how this could work. It was really important for us, as Lori and others have stated here, that we had an Indigenous-led process. And so a lot of that thought, and even with Susan, I'll say, you know, I think from Firelight's perspective and Susan's too, on both sides, there's a lot of learning on, you know, how do we do something like this, right? How do we look at this from an Indigenous lens, principally, instead of the inverse, right? Which is usually Western science and sprinkling in, you know, a bit of a tick box activity of Indigenous knowledge. And so it was an iterative process. It was an evolving process. But it really was kind of all of our groups working together, having open hearts, having open minds, and then approaching this together. Thanks. That's what I'll say.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
Sorry, I had to step out. I didn't hear the question.
That's okay. Kristen, do you want to just repeat it quickly?
Sure. So it was just about how this whole process got started, and as well as some lessons learned that could help other nations.
Oh, so yeah, Brian, I think it hit the nail on the head there about how we started it all. And then Firelight had, and Susan in particular, had great vision for us. She was the one that initiated that caribou camp. So thank you, Susan, for all of your hard work for this as well. Because I think that if she didn't help with the planning and getting us off the ground, it you know, so great, having a great team for other nations is good. Really, like Brian said, having the heart to want to do this types of things, and then having the right people in the room. So we reached out to people who are interested in caribou within our nation, and we had those people attend and be a part of our working group, as opposed to just randomly, you know, picking 5 members. We made sure that these folks were interested and wanted to be a part of this initiative, and I think that's, you know, another reason why it's so successful.
Amazing. Well, we are coming up on the end of our time together. This was a fantastic conversation. I'd just love to hear if any of you have any last comments to wrap this up for us today.
You know, okay, my hand was up. So is that
sorry,
okay if I speak?
I'm sorry, we don't have time. Sorry about that.
I think Susan might have trying to say?
I actually just wanted to add to that last point, which is that the funding that was provided for the Caribou camp came from the University of Alberta's Taking Care of the Land Fund. And I think it's important to recognize, because it was a very innovative, and I hope they're still running it, way of providing an opportunity for nations to do something that was really led by the nations. And it wasn't tied to a whole bunch of outcomes that you know, unfortunately, some of the other funding pots tend to be very tied to those particular outcomes that are from a very Western perspective. So giving a little shout out there to Taking Care of the Land, that funding pot.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments from any of our panelists before we wrap up?
No, I think this was great. And I hope that everybody looks at this and pushes for their own stewardship plan, or definitely use ours as a guide, or use it completely for their areas. And let's try to change the perspective and help these caribou, you know, and the lands that they need kind of come to fruition. So thanks everybody for attending and being here.
Yeah, and I just add to Lori's point there. ACFN, we're in a place now with the plan, you know, finalized, with other pieces in place, the report to industry coming up, the restoration standards and offsetting calculators being complete, where the next step for us really is going to be starting to push out the plan now. So the product is more or less complete now. And so we welcome people on this call, people that are interested, people you know that might be interested. Please reach out to us. You have our emails in the chat. Amanda and Kristen, you are more than welcome to share our contact information. Get in touch with us, and yeah, let's see how we can, you know, be defenders of caribou together. Right? Thank you.
Great closing words. Thanks to all of you for your great work. Sebastien, did you have a last thing you wanted to say? Sorry.
No, I'm fine. I just want to thank everyone for their attentiveness and eagerness to learn about the work that we did. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks to all of you for the incredible work that you put into creating this plan and setting a great example for other nations across Canada, and how to you know, put themselves in a leadership role for the protection and restoration of their caribou. So, and thanks to everyone who attended. We will circulate the recording for all those who didn't have a chance to get here at the beginning, and we look forward to seeing you again soon and seeing how things progress. We'll have to come back and maybe have this conversation again in a year or two once you've entered into the exciting work of implementing your plan. So best of luck to all of you.